With me, Tom Harwood. We've got a bumper show for you today with so many excellent guests. We'll be talking about how well the UK is really doing when it comes to climate change. We'll also be talking about some fake news circling about MPs and a potential solution to the climate crisis. All that and more on The Briefing coming up after the news.
I'm Amelia Harper. This is your news at 9 o'clock. £5.9 billion will be made available to help tackle NHS backlogs across England as part of the Chancellor's upcoming budget. Rishi Sunak will announce that £2.3 billion will be used to try to transform diagnostic services. £1.5 billion has been earmarked for increased bed capacity and new surgical hubs for elective surgeries. At least 100 community diagnostic centres will also be launched across England, offering CT, MRI and ultrasound scans. The Treasury says the funding will help millions of non-emergency patients.
Welcome the fact there's more money going into the health service this week. But again, more money won't help us if A&E departments are overburdened by, again, avoidable pressures related to COVID and actually other respiratory diseases.
Meanwhile, the Health Secretary says the government is heading towards legislating for mandatory COVID vaccines for NHS staff. A member of the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation is also urging NHS workers to get double jabbed as a matter of professional pride. Employment lawyer Gillian Howard told GBNews if double vaccination is enforced, medical exemptions are unlikely, but she says they could receive compensation if dismissed.
For NHS workers, it is unlikely there'll be any medical exemptions at all, and anyone who refuses to be double jabbed or who themselves can't be vaccinated because they themselves are medically compromised will either have to be paid on paid suspension or redeployed if there is any redeployment, or probably fairly dismissed.
In other news, the assistant director who handed actor Alec Baldwin a prop gun that killed a cinematographer was the subject of a safety complaint in 2019. Prop maker Maggie Goll has revealed she previously raised concerns about David Halls, stating he disregarded safety protocols for weapons on another project. The assistant director has not responded to requests asking for comment. Film critic Van Connor has told GBNews that camera crew raised safety concerns just hours before the fatal accident. Elsewhere, Insulate Britain restarted its road-blocking protest this morning, despite the risk of members being jailed or fined. The environmental group is targeting Canary Wharf, reportedly obstructing the Limehouse Causeway at 8:20 this morning. Another team of protesters have targeted Liverpool Street. Injunctions have already been imposed on some protesters after they caused major disruption on the M25 and many other of Britain's major roads. Elsewhere, the ultra-low emission zone is expanding in London today. It now covers a quarter of the capital. Drivers of older petrol or diesel cars will have to pay £1.50 a day to drive into the zone. The Mayor for London, Sadiq Khan, says the scheme will clean up for London's toxic air pollution. Our London reporter Alice Porter spoke to one man who says the ULEZ will damage his business.
The actual £12.50 daily was quite a shock. It's £60 a week extra for me to go to work. What with rising fuel costs and everything else, it's pretty much an extra tank of fuel a week. I got a little bit of an uplift with this contract, and that's now been completely taken away by the extra charge. It's been tough times for everyone through COVID, and being self-employed and trying to keep working has been quite tough as well. So I'm at the point where I don't think I can, at this moment, afford the extra cost of buying a new vehicle to suit the emissions.
In other news, the husband of detained British-Iranian aid worker Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe has gone on hunger strike for the second time in 2 years. Richard Ratcliffe is sleeping in a tent outside of the Foreign Office in London. It's after his wife lost the second appeal for freedom. Ms. Zaghari Ratcliffe has been held in jail in Iran since 2016, accused of plotting to topple the government. The Foreign Office says they are doing all they can to get Nazanin home. Friends actor James Michael Tyler has died aged 59 after being diagnosed with prostate cancer. Best known for his role as coffee shop manager Gunther, he revealed in June the disease had spread to his bones. The actor's representative said he died at home. And you may have been having trouble getting your groceries, but hopefully not now, because the website of Britain's biggest supermarket, Tesco, is back up and running after a suspected hacking. The outage left customers unable to shop or track their orders over the weekend. The supermarket giant said it was an attempt to interfere with its systems, but they say there's no reason to believe customer data has been affected. At the moment, shoppers may have to enter a virtual waiting room before accessing the site to manage traffic flow. I'll be back with more in half an hour. Now it's back to the point.
Welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Now, we've got a big bumper show coming up for you today. We'll be talking about sewage and fake news surrounding MPs' votes. That's to come later in a bit of a fact check. We're also talking about the planning system. There's an exciting new report out from the Social Market Foundation think tank that shows that potentially there could be a solution in people power. Also, what's the difference between a Twitter poll and a real poll? Well, we'll be talking to one industry expert about all of that and more. But first, what we'll be doing is, of course, talking about this big conference the UK is going to be hosting in just a week or so's time. COP26, one of the largest international summits ever hosted by the UK. Tens of thousands of delegates coming along internationally for this big event. But it also happens at a time when there are protests around the country. Insulate Britain are currently protesting in Canary Wharf. There have been many roads blocked. There have been some buildings vandalised. The question is, just why is the UK being so targeted by these protesters? How well are we doing internationally? Well, one way that we can compare ourselves to other countries internationally is by looking at a performance index. Indeed, Yale University has been producing a performance index on environmental factors that shows that the UK may not be doing so badly after all. In fact, when you look at all aggregate indicators, it seems that the UK is fourth in the world. Not last, not in the bottom half, but fourth in terms of how well we're doing. Well, to try and make sense of this all, I'm delighted that we can be joined by Dr. Zach Wendling, who's one of the principal authors of this report. Thank you so much for joining us, Zach. I know it's very early in the morning on the east coast of the United States. But first of all, this report, this index, ranking lots and lots of countries. The UK is pretty near the top. Why is that?
Well, like most wealthy democracies, the UK is performing well on traditional indicators like sanitation, heavy metals, sustainably managed waste. Exactly what we'd expect from a country of its level of development. But really, where the UK really stands out from its peers has been its rapid rate of decarbonization over the past decade.
So the UK seems to have been much, much faster than other comparable countries in terms of reducing CO2 output. I just want to take a step back, first of all, and question this index as a whole. What exactly is it measuring? There are lots of different factors that go into how a country can be ranked in terms of how it's doing environmentally. Mm-hmm.
Well, we take a data-driven approach looking at environmental outcomes, and we've come up for the 2020 version of the EPI with 32 different indicators about sustainability goals, how close countries are to meeting international targets. We grouped those into 11 different issue categories, everything ranging from heavy metals to deforestation, biodiversity protection, and greenhouse gas emissions. And we placed the greatest emphasis on the most pressing world problems, especially climate change.
So in terms of the UK being good at reducing CO2, that's been weighted higher and potentially shows that our system, our score, it potentially explains something behind our high score. What can other countries learn from the United Kingdom when it comes to something that we seem to have been doing quite well?
Well, probably the most encouraging part of the lessons from the UK is that even the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, with its foundation of coal, is able to make a break from its past, that the future can be bright for any country. Other experts have pointed to some important policies that the UK has used to drive their decarbonization, including an intentional shift away from coal toward natural gas and renewables, as well as an increased carbon price in 2013. So whether these exact policies make sense for other countries depends on their individual circumstances. But they also demonstrate the usefulness of an intentional shift away from carbon-intensive power sources and a reliance on economic incentives.
One of the energy sources that's quite reliable, that's good for base load energy and is low carbon, is nuclear power. Now, this has been quite contentious amongst some areas of environmental activism, some people in favour, others very much opposed. Does this index give any pointers to the utility of nuclear power?
Well, what the data shows is that virtually every time nuclear power plants are closed, they're replaced by fossil fuels, and CO2 emissions rise, at least in the short term. So, for example, in our index, Japan doesn't do very well because they had a rapid spike in CO2 emissions in 2012 following the closure of all of their nuclear plants. We also see in Germany the closure of nuclear power plants there has given to a rise in the use of very dirty coal sources. So this is a counterproductive initiative to close nuclear power if the goal is to continue decarbonization. So in general, countries that have a greater proportion of their power needs met by nuclear find it easier to meet decarbonization targets.
That's really, really interesting, especially as in the UK we've been suffering a little bit over the last couple of months because the wind hasn't been blowing quite as quickly as we would have liked in the North Sea. One further question, I suppose, is that it might look that some of these industrialised countries are doing relatively well, that CO2 emissions are tumbling. One of the criticisms, though, is that these are just countries that have simply offshored a lot of that CO2, offshored that carbon-intensive manufacturing capability, and we're simply importing goods that are produced, that are being produced through highly carbon-intensive industries in places like China. Is that potentially a valid criticism of your index?
Well, I think so. We're looking at how well countries are doing at performing, how well they're meeting their goals. And on a country-by-country basis, this offshoring of dirty pollution can matter quite a lot, but it varies. So our initial work on this, and we have ongoing projects looking at this offshoring or spillover work, is that the UK's greenhouse gas emissions might be 5% higher if we started to account everything that they import, which might be on the margin not so great, but other smaller countries like Switzerland, it could be account for more than double of what their current accounting tries to measure. So each country might want to think carefully about what their true consumption habits are driving as far as the environmental impacts they're creating, and adjust their policies to be more comprehensive. But internationally, globally, at the aggregate level, the important question is whether globally traded goods are produced with the cleanest processes and technologies that emit the least CO2. So even policies that are under consideration, like a border carbon adjustment, can still be useful if they spur production to move to cleaner countries, or if dirty countries adopt best practices and upgrade their equipment to reduce the carbon profile of the things that they produce.
That's really interesting that actually the offshoring of carbon emissions doesn't seem to be such a large problem for a country like the UK. 5% is not an incredibly high degree. Just a final question in this conversation while I've got you. COP26 starting next week. Lots of media controversy around it already. In your opinion, will this summit be a success?
Well, it depends on what you mean by success. I'd say that every COP is like a meal when you're on a diet. Individually, it's unsatisfying, but you're hoping that each one brings you closer to your goal. So we're not going to solve the climate crisis overnight, but time is growing short. So there's a lot of pressure to have something big happen at every COP, something that takes us a great leap forward. But it's hard to get 194 countries all moving in the same direction. But we can hope for some bold, credible leadership that can spur some real change in a widespread selection of countries. And that at least would avoid doing anything counterproductive.
Dr. Zach Wendling from the Yale Centre for Environmental Law and Policy, thank you so much for joining us. One of those authors of that index that is really, really interesting and worth looking up. Thanks again for joining us this morning, very early in the morning for you, here on The Briefing on GB News. Now, moving on, the Tories' planning bill is in the deep freeze after opposition arose and a change of housing secretary came about. The housing department now says it's in listening mode. People power over planning could help fix the housing crisis is the title of a new report from the Social Market Foundation think tank. And given that the housing department is in listening mode, this could be a very interesting time to publish such a report. The report says that the country is ground down in planning gridlock at the moment because too much power is being given to planning authorities and too little opportunity is afforded to neighbours to find win-win solutions. Well, I'm delighted that I can say that we're now joined by Steve Baker, the senior Conservative MP who's written the foreword to this very report into the housing crisis. And Steve, win-win solutions sound pretty fantastical. Is this just a bit of a unicorn here?
No, of course it's not. Win-win solutions happen every day in free markets. People only buy things because they need them, they want them, and usually that is a win-win. You buy what you need, and the person selling it to you is glad to make a profit for providing you with those goods. Look, the situation is we can't proceed any longer with people who rent homes in despair of ever buying, sometimes in despair even of saving up the deposit that they need. So what we need to do is realign people's incentives, give people the power to say no, but the incentives to say yes. So what this paper is doing is saying that the planning bill should give local people supplementary powers to say yes to development where they can see that it is in their interests. And I think that's very much to be welcomed because all the time we have a state land use planning system which sets homeowners against those who want to be new entrants at buying a home. All the time that continues, we're going to have the kind of deadlock and political crisis that we've seen over planning indefinitely.
There has been an extraordinary degree of deadlock and political crisis. There have been so many attempts under successive governments to fix what is, I think, most people recognise as a completely broken planning system, and they have just simply failed and failed again. Is this one going to be radical enough to have long-term change sort of set in, but also moderate enough that it's able to pass the House of Commons? It's an incredibly tricky tightrope to walk.
Well, it is a tricky tightrope, but what I would say is actually profoundly conservative. It harks back to some of the ideas which were around before the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. Let's not forget that we often talk about place. We often talk about the areas of our country, the towns, the cities, the neighbourhoods that we most value. And I would say, in my experience, thinking about my own constituency of Wickham, the places we most value are the ones which emerged spontaneously before they were planned by councils. And I think that's a challenge for everybody. We should be thinking about the rights of those who own property and also the desires of those who wish to own property and move into it. And if we had a system whereby there's a win-win, that those who are in homes get the opportunity to say yes to development that benefits those who are coming in, I think actually it is possible to see that in the past, in a very conservative way, areas developed in ways which suited everybody. And in fact, they're some of our most precious areas today. So I think that it shouldn't be thought of as radical. It should be a recognition that having councils impose development on the public isn't working, it isn't going to work. And what we need to do is change people's incentives.
And some of the most beautiful places in this country are actually those sort of streets that were built up over hundreds of years, and sort of the lovely little nooks and crannies and cobbled areas. I mean, these areas are sort of really quite human when they're not necessarily directly imposed by government, but built up by communities. I was reading a piece of yours in, I believe it was The Telegraph over the weekend, where you said that the Tories really can't afford to give up on planning reform. You seem to be pretty clear-headed that unless more houses are built, unless this country can maintain itself as a property-owning democracy, your party may well be in a bit of electoral peril. Do your colleagues agree with you?
I think people do realise that we'll be in peril, but we're in peril on both sides of the argument, of course, because homeowners will put us in peril when they don't like the planning we impose upon them. And young people, of course, need to be given hope. I mean, what is our offer to young people now? On student loans, on housing, on national insurance going up, you know, these are not things which offer hope to young people. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that the Conservative Party is a party that does believe in freedom, is the party which should be offering hope and aspiration to young people. But that aspiration's got to be founded in really practical things like the opportunity to own your own home. So yes, I do believe the Conservative Party is in electoral peril, both in the short and the long run, if we don't sort out this problem created by councils having the power to impose development on neighbourhoods who don't want it. It's creating endless conflict, and we need to admit that it's time to learn from great Nobel laureates like Elinor Ostrom, who show us how communities can take over and have more power to do what is a win-win for them and for those who wish to buy.
Now, just finally and very quickly, there's a new housing secretary and a new mega housing department. Do you believe that Michael Gove might be receptive to this report?
Well, I hope Michael is. I certainly will write to him and make sure that he has seen it. And obviously, we want to talk about it. Michael's got a great track record of delivery in government. And I would think that if anyone can sort out the planning system in government, then it will be Michael. But my hope is that he will do it by recognising that people's incentives need to be aligned, and that actually, as a Conservative Party, we really do believe in people power. It's something we've said throughout my time as an MP. I now want to make it very real.
Well, that's a positive note to end on. Steve Baker will be following the progress of this proposal with very, very carefully. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning on GB News. Now, a vote last week in Parliament has initiated a social media storm that has only built over the weekend, with many MPs now reporting abusive communication from an increasingly irate public. Yes, social media has been awash in recent days of confused members of the public hurling abuse at politicians, accusing them of deliberately polluting our waterways with raw sewage. Articles began to spring up, inciting more rage, like this one from the left-wing activist website Evolve Politics, which was reportedly shared incredibly widely. Its headline read, "Here's a list of every MP who just voted to allow water companies to continue dumping raw sewage in our rivers." Did they really? Or are things perhaps just a little bit more complicated? What is this all about? Well, the Environment Bill is making its way through Parliament. Not that you'd know from all the headlines around it, but this is actually a bill that itself is designed to get tougher on water and waste management. The chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, Philip Dunn, himself a Tory MP, wrote an amendment to reduce storm overflow discharges, crucially with a fully costed plan to do so. So far, so simple. Well, when the bill reached the Lords, a further amendment was attached with an uncosted proposal to ban all storm overflows. The amendment was tabled by the 9th Duke of Wellington, no less, a hereditary peer whose great-great-great-great-great-grandfather defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, I'm sorry, Your Grace, but having a familial connection to Waterloo doesn't necessarily make you much of a plumbing expert, despite the name. Indeed, this amendment could have actually both accidentally cost hundreds of billions of pounds and divert sewage into our streets, instead of down waterways at times of high pressure on the system. Gloucester MP Richard Graham sits on the Bill Committee for this legislation, and he said it would lead to stratospheric amount of spending on new sewage systems. He went on to warn that it may cause discharges into the streets during extreme rain, when currently discharge is allowed to prevent flooding. Yes, this clearly well-intentioned well-intentioned but poorly drafted amendment, far from being an easy fix to prevent relatively rare events of overflow discharge into waterways, could have instead ended up flooding our streets and houses with raw sewage instead. Some estimates suggest that digging up the entirety of the UK's Victorian sewage infrastructure could cost taxpayers more than was spent on the entire pandemic. So this amendment would have committed the government to splurge an uncosted, functionally unlimited amount of taxpayer cash that is likely to run into the hundreds of billions of pounds to attempt to fix a problem all in one go, which in the meantime may mean more sewage discharged into streets rather than waterways at times of flooding. Well, now it doesn't all sound so simple, does it? The irony is that ministers weren't bringing forward an environment bill that's trying to deal with some of these issues in a methodical and costed way. If they weren't bringing forward that bill, that amendment wouldn't have been tabled. These headlines wouldn't have happened, and MPs would have had an easier life. The concerning conclusion to draw here may be that MPs might get an easier time by simply ignoring issues rather than attempted to finding costed solutions. And that should worry us all. Well, now to turn to another story that has amazed me over the weekend. The Observer newspaper yesterday ran a peculiar story, quite prominently. The headline read, "Only 8% of schools in England have received air monitors promised by the government." The subheader said that survey showed that Minister is falling short of pledge. Shocking. And more than a little eyebrow-raising. Let's look at that article in a little more detail. It read, a Twitter poll by a primary school head teacher said last week that, there it is, a Twitter poll by a primary school head teacher revealed last week. It then linked to the Twitter poll in the article. This was the Twitter poll that the entire story rested on. This. I have to say, I absolutely despair. Now, some of you watching will be absolutely shocked that this could be so horrendously misreported. Others will be asking, what's the issue here? Well, one man who can help us understand this all is Adam Drummond, the Associate Director of the strategic insight agency Opinium. Adam, welcome to the programme. Now, lots of people will be looking at that poll that was on Twitter saying, well, 8% of people did say they didn't see a CO2 monitor. Isn't it entirely accurate to therefore say that only 8% of the country has CO2 monitors? What's the problem here?
So the problem is basically exactly the second part of that sentence, which is the gap between 8% of people who answered this poll and 8% of the country. So the main thing to remember with Twitter polls is that we have no idea who's answered them. I mean, I think there's ways of looking, but ultimately we have no idea how many people actually have answered that, how many of them are teachers, how many of them work at the same school, how many of them are just random people like you or me who decided to click on it for fun. We have no information about any of the details of who actually answered that poll. The two things basically with any kind of poll that you ever see on the news or anywhere else is basically what have they asked and who have they asked. We can see from that Twitter poll the actual question that was asked by the user who put it up, but we have no information at all about who was asked and who took part, and we have no idea whether or not that is in any way representative of the wider population of teachers. And just quickly, as somebody who has done polling among teachers, it's really difficult and it's quite specialized. And I think it's pretty unlikely that a selection of 1,000 or 1,500 Twitter users is going to be in any way representative of what teachers think across the country.
So the problem here is that polls posted on Twitter, anyone can click on them and answer, and you don't know who those people are. It's entirely self-selecting, and it's not potentially representative. There's an official organisation in the UK called the British Polling Council that regulates the industry. How does it regulate official opinion pollsters to make sure that they're a lot better than just a random poll asking random people on Twitter?
So fundamentally, what the British Polling Council does, it's about enforcing transparency standards. So we as an organisation at Opinion, when we do a poll, and again, not to sort of knock the Observer because they have a proud history of publishing good quality polls by, among others, ourselves. But what British Polling Council organisations sign up to is a set of disclosure standards. So we are obliged to in order to remain members and in order to say that we're members, we have to publish the full data and tables for any poll that we conduct that enters the public domain. And that has to show you the full text of the questions that were asked, and it has to show you the breakdown demographically of who was asked as well. So you can make sure, and kind of interested members of the public can do the sort of due diligence and hold us to account by looking and making sure that, oh, you've got the right number of men, women, young people, old people, Labour voters, Tory voters. And it can
that's
very,
the
very
crucial
quickly
point, isn't it? It's the weighting. It's the making sure that you have a representative number of men, women, regions, ages, voting intentions. That helps you understand a reflective picture of the country, as opposed to just a random group of people who may well be self-selecting and entirely unrepresentative.
Exactly that. And then the one other crucial point, actually, is that even if a poll on Twitter does have the right demographic balance, only about 25% of people are on Twitter. So there's ways in which a sample can be completely unrepresentative, which aren't immediately obvious, but which are actually really important. And as everyone's fond of saying, Twitter is not Britain, and Twitter's opinions don't necessarily represent the country as a whole.
Well, what a fantastic point to end on. Twitter is not Britain, and potentially journalists should be a little bit more wary of what goes on Twitter that might not reflect the country at large. Well, Adam Drummond of Opinium, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in this interview and indeed the show. Well, coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Maroki, but first, here's the weather.